take Ranjini too seriously on the introduction that she gave me. Of course, as the organizer of the program, she is bound to speak a few good words, which sometimes may not have to be taken as a face value. Plus, the fact that I've been associated with CPPR may compel all of them to speak in sweeter tone about me than what is necessary. But I had come here definitely with a sense of happiness as well as with a sense of challenge. The sense of happiness that I have is that occasionally we lawyers get to speak to non-lawyerly group, and today happens to be one where I understand that except one person, I do not know who amongst you is from a law background. Who is the one with the law background? You're the one. Oh, there are two with a law background. Okay. So it's still a mixed bunch of people from various disciplines without necessarily a clear grounding in law, and that's a matter of happiness in fact, for the reason that this is a rare opportunity for a lawyer to get to interact with, and that to officially interact, formally interact on a platform with a non-lawyerly, primarily a non-lawyerly group of audience. And that indeed poses a challenge too, because the challenge is that sometimes as a lawyer you tend to speak using some legal phrases, using some legal jargon, using some legal language, which may befit, which may not really befit the audience, and therefore you might sometimes have to tide over this difficulty and try to come down to the basics of these legalese terms that you use, and therefore that's a kind of a challenge that I carry today. I understand that there has already been one or two topics that somebody covered on various aspects of law. Is that right? Somebody covered basics of legal research, and there was something on judiciary, and I'm told that some lawyer, Madhu was saying, sorry?
Jitin. One movie on our topic policy and another on the basics of legal research.
Right.
And
Okay.
From the reviews, I don't think
Very well, very well. That indeed explains the challenge that I carry today. Well, you know the topic for the day, right? The topic that I chose for myself to speak on reads like this: judicial policies involved in deciphering legislative policies. Judicial policies. I understand that all of you are interested in what you call as public policy, which is still a phrase that I am sure has several layers of meaning, but you've all comprehensively called it public policy, which is an area of your interest and the area that you would want to embrace in life. Now, I am speaking about policy which is necessarily linked to public policy as you would conceive it, but from two different perspectives. One is, the one aspect of the topic is judicial policies. That is, how judiciary conceives public policy. And two, how the legislature conceives public policy. So that's why I've called it as judicial policies involved in deciphering public legislative policies. So I haven't, of course I must confess that I haven't still circulated any reading material or anything. I thought it would be more of a casual interaction, trying to understand from you as well as to what you think about how judiciary in your various jurisdictions that you come from react to various legislative policies that a legislature or the king or the government, by whichever name you want to call the entity that makes the law, would want to come out with. And therefore, essentially, what we are trying to understand today is the close interaction, close or otherwise I would say, depending upon the jurisdictions that you are familiar with, the close interaction, as I would see in the Indian context, between three entities. And the three entities that I am going to keep in mind are: one, the courts, the court of law, that's the judiciary. Two, or rather I would put the two as one. First is the legislature. Now, are you all coming from, let me not give myself the comfort of sitting. So, are you all coming from jurisdictions where there is a proper legislature that makes the law, or do you have some other mechanisms by which laws are formed? you're all familiar with how law is made in your country. In India, for example, it is the parliament, Indian parliament, the legislature that comes up with a law. Now, is there any other form of law making that you're all generally familiar with in your respective jurisdictions? Or is it the legislature, that is the elected group of representatives of people who are always indulged in the process of making of law? Is it? It is, right? Okay. So there you have the first entity that I'm going to mention about is this entity, which is the lawmaker, that is the legislature. The second entity that I'm going to mention about is the courts, that is the judiciary. Now, how do you see judiciary vis-a-vis, that is judiciary qua the legislature? How do you see judiciary? What is the judiciary's function? If I say that the function of the legislature is in making or enacting a law, then what would you think is the function of the judiciary? Regulating is one word. Is there any other word or phrase or explanation that comes to anybody's mind?
Using those laws and dealing with the cases. What is that?
Dealing with the cases, that's another way of how judiciary grapples with the law. Excellent. Interpreting a law. Interpreting a law, therefore, when the enacted law leaves you with an ambiguity, it is the duty of the court to get into it and explain what the law means. Because once the law is created, the legislature keeps its hands off. It does not get into the process of interpreting that law. And that essentially is a task which is all the time, around the globe, in all jurisdictions, taken to be the role of the judiciary, one of the prominent roles of the judiciary. Regulating is a very good example. Judiciary enforces the law. Then you said something else. Yeah, dealing with the cases. That's another layer of saying regulations. That is. So therefore, in respect of which entity is it that the lawmaker as well as the judiciary looks at the law? The answer is simple: the society. Therefore, if you take a triangle, there are three entities that I'm going to be bothered about today. One is the legislature, which is the lawmaker. Now, of course, when I say legislature makes the law, I would also not forget the fact that there are times when there are other entities also who are empowered to make the law. For example, the legislature in a particular statute or legislation would empower certain other executive wings of the state to make what is called delegated legislation. So, for example, that seems to be a point that carries everybody's favor and does not need so much of explanation. But just to give an example, if the legislature comes up with, say for example in India, if there is a legislation that comes up with Food Corporation of India Act, and there is a Food Corporation of India which is formed, then the legislation can itself provide for the Food Corporation of India to come up with further delegated legislations for its day-to-day functioning. If Reserve Bank of India is formed by way of a legislation, then after that the legislature keeps its hands off. It is for the Reserve Bank of India to come up with the regulatory delegated legislations to regulate the various banks in India from time to time. So the legislature on top will delegate the power to further legislate to its own creature sometimes. But not ignoring the fact, I say today for the purpose of convenience, that law making primarily is the law of the legislature. The other entity that I talked about is the judiciary. Let me call it courts, C. And the third entity that I spoke about is the society. So, my topic today is how the judiciary conceives the law which is enacted by the legislature and which is made for the society. So, what is the interrelation? The interrelation is that the legislature makes the law for the society, right? Is there anybody? This is a very, very elementary point. I don't think this needs any explanation. When the legislature comes out with the law, it's for the society that the legislature comes up with the law. Now, what does the society do with that law. Either the society obeys the law, right? Or the society challenges the law. As a member of the society, now I understand that at least a few of you will have interactions to get into this part of the scheme of things that we are today talking about. A few of you may have political ambitions, a few of you may have ambitions to become elected representatives of the people, a few of you may want to work on this side, and of course at least two of you belong to this side. You could belong to this as well as belong to this, belong to this as well as belong to this, and belong to any of this and still belong to this. It's a very closely knit arrangement of three entities where the legislature makes the law for the society. That's an elementary point. The society, if does not want to appreciate the law, if the society wants to challenge the law by saying that either this law is not needed or this law is excessive, for example, if the legislature comes up with an anti-terrorist law which gives wide powers to the police authorities, and the society thinks that irrational, unproportionate powers are vested with the police, and the society thinks that such law is dangerous for the society and it wants to challenge it, where does the society go? As a public policy researchers, you will of course have a recourse to the government, and I understand that this is a very, very ambitious aspect that would lie deep in everyone's mind, that is called lobbying before the lawmakers to revise the law. Now that, I'm not ignoring the fact that you have a recourse to lobby before the legislature, but let me assume that the legislature is intact with its understanding of the law, is obstinate and inflexible with the law that it has created, and does not want to change the law. Therefore, your recourse is here. The society goes to the court to examine the law that is enacted, right? Therefore, the interrelation starts here, where somebody makes the law for somebody, and that somebody being agreed with the law goes to somebody else to have that law struck down, to have that law set aside. Now, assuming that the law is not challenged and therefore the law stays intact, or assuming that the law is challenged but the challenge is set aside and therefore the law stands intact, then the law stands, and therefore the society is supposed to obey the law, right? And if there is a deviation, then the legislature takes the concerned errant in the society to the court of law, which is what he said as cases. Suppose there is a law that says that you cannot do X, and you do X, then you are again taken to a court of law for the purpose of violating the law, and the court of law confers the punishment on you. Therefore, the three entities. Therefore, when you are speaking about law, therefore when you are speaking about legislature, therefore when you are speaking about the society which is supposed to undergo the law, or in the alternative wants to challenge the law, or you are speaking about the court which is supposed to examine the law so as to see whether its challenge is a worthy enough challenge, or if the challenge does not succeed, then to ensure that the law is enforced for the society, you necessarily will have to keep in mind the interrelation between these three entities, that is the legislature, the society and the courts, and that is where my topic is relevant, and I believe also from a public policy research perspective. Whenever you go back to your country and whenever you look at any piece of legislation that you're concerned with, you will have to keep in mind these three entities, and you will have to keep in mind as to, if you have to raise a challenge to the law, how would the court react? And here I say the court can react at a law through the eyes of the society, or the court can react to the society through the eyes of the law. Therefore, essentially the court's function, which I am going to explain today, is to look at the society from the eyes of the law, or in the alternative, to look at the law from the eyes of the society. And this forms the fulcrum of my today's interaction with you. where I would try and explain, basically from an Indian perspective. I have not been educated in an interdisciplinary background like Ranjini has been, and I have not practiced anywhere, though I've gone abroad and met my clients who are multinationals in the United States and elsewhere. I have not necessarily practiced in courts of law in any other part of this world other than in this country, and therefore my familiarity and today's coverage of my speech would primarily be based on Indian examples, but I must tell you that these Indian examples are just indicative of how a court of law would typically react anywhere in the globe. So when I am taking an Indian example, please don't think that it is peculiar to India alone to the exclusion of the remaining jurisdictions, some of which from which you come from. It is definitely something that touches upon the reaction that a court would have anywhere in the globe towards an enacted piece of law, or towards the society which is supposed to either obey the law, or if it has some natural dissent to the law, then without violating the law, go to the court and have it set aside by challenging it. You cannot take the law into the hands is a common knowledge that everybody shares. What does that mean? It does not mean that you are not left, it does not mean that you don't have a recourse if you are dissatisfied with the law. Definitely you can take the law itself to the court and get it set aside, and as a public policy researcher you would even be ambitious of lobbying against the law before the government or the state which has enacted the law itself. But the natural recourse for a citizen available is to take it to the court and challenge it. Therefore let me just take out the two branches aside and look at first how a court of law looks at the society through the eyes of law, and secondly, how a court of law would look at the law itself through the eyes of the society, and give you some Indian examples which would make it very clear. Now when I say that as a public policy researcher, when you are appreciating the court's role, you will have to first look at how the court of law looks at the society through the eyes of law. That is, I am covering this aspect first. This is my first coverage, and this is the second route that I am going to take. So when I am explaining how a court of law through the eyes of law looks at the society, the first principle that I would like to put forward is that the law is looked at traditionally by courts anywhere in the globe in its literal perspective. The first rule of interpreting law is to read the law grammatically, literally, in a commonsensical perspective, not get into its extended meanings or its interpretations which come at a secondary level. The first principle of law anywhere in the world, which in the Great Britain this rule was started, which is called the rule of literal interpretation of law, which was followed in all kinds of jurisdictions around the world. That is, look at a law and read it like you read a novel or a short story or a piece of essay or a piece of, as you read common English or in whichever language the law is enacted. Do not give it more than commonsensical meaning. Therefore, on the first look of it, if a law says something, then do not give it any other meaning, because it is not for the courts to attribute meaning if the meaning is otherwise clear from the one which has enacted the law. So at that level, the court restricts its own role merely to the extent of enforcing a clear law. So the first point is, by reading a law, you have sufficient clarity, then the courts would refrain from going into anything further. So the first rule of interpretation of a law is to look at law from a common grammatical perspective. Now when I say that, you must also understand that sometimes the law itself deals with some technical aspects. Suppose the law deals with, say, relationship between two states within a country or two countries regarding a water body that flows between them. Then the law may explain some terms about hydraulics. Now that is not something that a layman may know. Or say if the law is concerning itself with technology, or the law concerns itself with a business, how business is regulated, then the law will have certain technical terms within it. That is, an enacted piece of legislation will have certain technical terms within it. So when I say that a law will have to be looked at from literal perspective, I also take within it that the law will have to be looked at from a literal perspective of those who know the domain knowledge. Is that clear? So if the law is regarding technology and I am not a person from technical background, then for me that law may not be understandable. Then the court will have to rise above my understanding and look at it from a technocrat's perspective of the law. So for a technocrat, is that law literally reading to be like this, or is that law literally reading to be something else? So the law has to be read in the literal perspective, would also take within it the fact that the literal meaning will have to be the standard of those who has a domain experience in that particular area. So that's the first principle of reading law, that is, read law from a literal perspective. Now, here comes the difficulty. Sometimes you read a law, and of course you read a law even from the perspective, try to read a law literally even from the perspective of somebody who has a certain domain expertise in that area, and still the law is not clear. This is where the court's role gets intensified. If the law leaves you with an ambiguity, which it does, mind you, round the globe, round the year, every day you go to a courtroom, you will have a law which leaves ambiguity. And that is why the function of lawyers, that is why the function of judges, that is why you have lawyers everywhere on the globe interpreting a law, using a comma within an enacted statute, using a full stop in a law, using a punctuation, whatever is writ large on the face of an enacted piece of law, that is all made use of during the course of interpretation, because no law can be left without a possibility of interpretation and therefore an ambiguity. Therefore, when I say that law has to be read like a piece of short story, or law has to be read like a piece of a novel, I possibly was simplifying or oversimplifying it. A law sometimes defies the possibility of being read so simplistically. By its very nature, any legislation that any legislature is able to come up with will have enough maneuvering space for ambiguity and therefore for debates. That's the experience that civilizations have had all through the history of mankind. That any enacted law is not left without ambiguity. Even a word, a simple word used in a simple section or a clause in a broad statute can be argued for days and days, and that happens in our courts every day. Even one word is being interpreted in 2 different or 3 different or 4 different manners every day in our courtrooms. Leave aside one clause that contains the word, or leave aside the whole statute that contains that clause. Even one word can go for arguments that consume so much of time of the judiciary. Therefore, the second role of the judiciary is to decode what can be quote unquote called the real meaning of the law. Now, is there something called the real meaning? Who is to understand? I say, as a person who has taken a case to the court, that this has to be the real meaning of the law. My opponents say, no, the real meaning of the law has to be something else. The judge, after all the adjudication, says that the real meaning is something and not something else. The matter goes into an appeal before a higher court. The higher court judge reverses it. It might sometimes go to a second appeal. It might go to the highest court of this country, and then the whole thing may get further reversed. Now, therefore, you have several interpretations here. Somebody says it has to be read like this, somebody else opposes it. The one who hears and adjudicates it says it has to be interpreted in one particular manner. His higher authority says it has to be interpreted in a different manner. His own higher authority says it. And this is a whole lot of confusion that happens. So this is something that we deal with on a daily basis. Now, I had a recently I'll give you one example. I had a recent experience when, this is just to exemplify what this confusion can be. My client, I'm a lawyer, and my client took a piece of land on lease. You're all familiar with what is lease or rent. Took a piece of land for rent for 25 years. This happened just recently, last week. I mean, this case happened last week, but he had taken it 2 years back. Now the understanding was that if you are taking it for 25 years, then the landowner said, for the first 1 year, I will forego the rental amount. Because you are taking it for 25 years, you are building a petrol pump over it, and that's going to be a substantial business. And I am charging a certain fee at a later stage. So for the first 1 year, I will not collect any lease from you. Because you are yourself to undergo some construction over it, you will spend certain money. Looking at your financial difficulty in the initial period, for first 1 year I am waiving off my rent that I have to get. Second year onwards, you have to necessarily keep it for 25 years. You cannot break it in between and say, I don't want anything, I don't want this, I am returning. In case you are prematurely terminating that arrangement, then you have to pay me the first 1 month of lease that I have forgone. Right? 1 year, sorry, first 1 year of lease that I have forgone. Thanks. Is that clear? So this was the arrangement. Now I am just giving an example of how much can this go for an interpretation. A simple arrangement like this. Any one of you can get into this kind of an arrangement any point of time during your life. Now, the question became intense because the service tax authority in this country took the view that if you are and my client prematurely terminated it in the second year or running the second year, my client said the entire business has gone for a toss and it will not be financially viable to build a petrol pump here and take it for 25 years. I am cancelling it, I am willing to pay you my notice period. Rent I am willing to pay you. Plus, I will give you, as per the understanding, the rent for the first 1 year. So much so good. Now the service tax authority in this country took the view that this rent which is collected after the expiry of the first 1 year is delayed payment of rent. So whenever you get rent as a landlord, you need to pay a certain percentage as tax to the service tax authority. You are a service provider. You are giving your property on lease, so you are giving a service. Now if you are giving service, you collect a certain amount of compensation for that service from the other party. A part of that compensation has to go to the state. So the arrangement of law on this is that a landowner who gives his property for building a permanent construction for business purpose has to give to the state a part of what he gets as compensation, as a lease amount towards the service tax. Now service tax authority said this is late payment of rent towards you, and therefore late payment of service tax to us, and therefore you need to pay penalty on that. You understood what it is? It's a clear case if you look at it generally. Yes, it's a late payment of rent.
But this tax department asking from the owner of the land or the person?
The owner of the land. The service provider has to pay the rent. But the understanding between them, between the owner and my client, is that the service tax which owner has to give will be reimbursed by me. Therefore, my client came to me saying that I not only have to pay in the service tax now, which anyway I am willing to pay because I am paying the rent, but I also have to pay interest towards penalty that he is supposed to pay the government. Now that's coming up to a huge amount. How to escape? Department has already taken a view that you need to pay service tax because this is rent that you are collecting, and you need to pay interest towards penalty on the service tax. Therefore, I had to advise. Now, I advise the client like this, and not blowing my own trumpet. I'm just trying to tell you how a lawyer can take a different view and how laws are ambiguous. I said you cannot call this payments that you made today as delayed payment of rent. It is a penalty that you are paying towards premature termination. The moment it is penalty, there is no service tax. It is only for the purpose of quantification of the amount of penalty that you have linked it with the initial period. If you don't link it with the period or don't stipulate an amount, then nobody will know what the penalty is. Therefore, you said my penalty would be, in effect, if you read the arrangement, the contract, it would only give the meaning that you are not paying a delayed rent. You are paying a rent
You are paying your normal rent. In between, if you are terminating, you are supposed to give a compensation. Now, for compensation, the government cannot tax the other side. And if the government cannot tax the other side, we cannot get it reimbursed from you. So go and clarify before the department that you can take your hands off. You cannot claim anything from him, and therefore I am not going to pay you. Now, is this something that the law clarifies? No. This is my interpretation. Now the department said no. The moment you have linked it with the first year, and the first year lease was unpaid, it is definitely payment of lease. It is not penalty. I said no, it is penalty. It is only for the purpose of quantification that. Then I took the second point of view that even if it is penalty, and even if it is not penalty, it is a lease. I was not required to pay the lease at that point in time. The trigger that happened, which made me liable to pay that lease, has happened only right now, because I prematurely terminated it. And therefore, even if it is lease, it was not lease payable at that point. It is lease payable today. If it is lease payable today, it was not service tax payable at that point. It is service tax payable today. And if it is service tax payable today, then there is no delay in service tax and therefore no interest. Doesn't that make sense? Look at it from the state's perspective. I am told that yesterday somebody came and explained to you tax. Look at it from the tax enforcer's perspective. How many people can get away? This is what I call the ambiguity that the law lays down. The matter will travel to the court. I will make my argument. Other side will make his argument. Government will step in, will make its own argument. The judge will decide in a particular manner. It will go to the appellate court. He will decide in a particular manner. It will go to the further appellate court. After 5 years or 6 years, when you have the final order from the final appellate authority, then alone will, on this one simple little point, the law will be settled. On one simple point for the law to be settled, now it is going to take several years of judicial time. And one doesn't know which way the courts will go. One doesn't know which way the final court will go. So, whenever you come up with a legislation, any legislation by its inherent nature will leave you with enough of maneuvering space to battle your case within the walls of that legislation, and therefore the legislation is not left without ambiguity. And here is what the courts will have to do at that point in time. The court will have to take a step back. So first is, court will look at it strictly from the legislation's perspective. Second is, if the legislation is unclear, the court will go a step back and look at it from an imaginary perspective, imagining itself to be the one who enacted the legislation. If I had enacted the legislation, what would have been my intention at that point of time while enacting this particular word, this particular clause, or this particular statute? That is called the rule of purposive interpretation of statutes. The first rule is the rule of literal interpretation, and the second rule is the rule of purposive interpretation. That is, you go to the soul of the law. You step back and look at the law from the perspective of the one who has formulated the law, and think as to what was the intention of the legislature which came up with this law. So the second rule, which is popularly called what's the mischief involved, or what was the problem involved in that law? Second is, this is the second, what was the mischief? Third is, therefore, because of the mischief, what is the law enacted? What is the new law that is enacted, or what is the law that is enacted to take care of this mischief? And fourth is, what does this law say? What is the new law? This is what is the new law, and what does it say? Now this is where the difficulty is. So, to understand what does the law say, to understand exactly what is the meaning of four, you go back to these first three questions. What
was the social situation or the legal situation before the law was enacted? Now, as public policy researchers, this will be extremely important for you. What was the social situation or legal situation before the law was enacted? What was the mischief that existed in that social or legal situation? And therefore, what is the new law? And therefore, what does the new law say? Clear? Go back. Yeah. So, all this we are bothered about only when the law is unclear. Right? When the law is clear, there is no doubt. You just simply enforce the law literally, grammatically. So, the moment the law is unclear, you take a step back. You, in the sense, the court. The court takes a step back and looks at first question, that is, what existed before this law was enacted. Now, sometimes there is no law before this particular law was enacted. Sometimes there is a law, but that law is inadequate and therefore a new law is enacted. So, what was the situation earlier? Social situation or legal situation, as the case may be. In such social situation or legal situation, what was the problem because of which a new law had to be enacted? Or because of which for the first time a law had to be enacted, as the case may be. Right? Now, in that, considering that, what is the law that was formed? And fourthly, what does that law say? Clear? So these are the four. I mean, this, of course, it is not as clear. It is not as clear as I am trying to make it sound. The moment you go into these four questions, you can be rest assured that one case will take so many hours of judicial time or so many days of judicial time, and that's at one level. In a typical Indian situation, it can take 25 years to get a final resolution. So, this is how the court almost identifies with the lawmaker. Otherwise, the court is only a law interpreter. But being a law interpreter, if it is not able to understand the literal meaning, or if the literal meaning leads to an absurdity, the court cannot enforce what is absurd. Therefore, the court goes back into the purpose of the law, tries to identify as close as possible with the law maker itself, and tries to look at these four questions. Now, even if you are a judge, wouldn't you do the same? This is exactly what you would do, right? So it makes sense. Now, the question that came up typically before courts world over is, how do you understand this? How do you understand 1 and 2? What is the material? Now, here is where I am linking the topic with the public policy researchers' interests and concerns. What is the material that is before a court of law to understand the mischief that existed in the law before this law, or the society before this law, and that you can take it forward. In Britain, they said for understanding these two, you cannot look at the parliamentary material itself. That means, typically what comes to your mind if you are a judge and you have to understand what the legislature would have said in a particular context, what comes to your mind? You will say, I will look at the speeches made in the parliament, I mean the legislature. At that point in time, the debates that happened, at the point of time when the law was enacted, the debates that happened amongst the members of the legislature can be one material that can be looked at to understand what was the problem in the situation before. Wouldn't you think so? Typically that's what you should look at. But in Britain they said no. Now here is where I am posing various challenges before you. What they said in Britain was very simple. They said we want to understand the meaning of the law. The Hayden's rule is very clear that we have to understand the meaning of the law, because without which we cannot resolve this burning issue with which a person has come before us. But I will not look at what was spoken in the House of Legislature at the point of time when the law was enacted, because one, they said it is an inarticulate mental process of each person involved in the House that has finally resulted in the law. It is an inarticulate mental process. You will never be able to understand what a person thought at that point in time.
Two, even if you can understand what a person spoke at that point of time from the speech that is recorded, everyone may not have thought of the same. So everybody may not have had accord of thoughts at the point of time when the law was enacted. To put it very tersely, I am using an American jurist explanation here. An American jurist said this is the problem. He said, very tersely I am putting it, he said, those who spoke and those who did not speak might not have meant the same thing. At the point of time when the law is enacted, a lot of debates happen. The concerned minister who is moving the bill, which has to become the legislation, definitely will speak. Those who support will speak, those who oppose will speak. But there are so many of them who do not speak, and finally who too will vote in the process. Right? So he said those who spoke and those who did not speak, what each one of them thought cannot be understood. Even those who spoke would not have agreed with each other inside their mind. Therefore, the phrase called intention of the legislature is still extremely blurred, and for this reason we will exclude the parliamentary material. This is what in Britain they were inclined to say for a very long period of time. In US, however, this rule was a little relaxed. If you see typically the US decisions, you will see that a lot of places were there in the United States, a lot of cases were there where they were really inclined to look at the parliamentary material. For example, they did not merely look at what the minister spoke at that point in time, or what somebody who wanted to, now who wants to speak? A minister will speak who is moving the bill. Or somebody who wants an amendment into the bill will speak. He will propose, I want this amendment, so he will also speak. Somebody who opposes the bill will speak. Somebody who supports the bill will speak. Somebody who opposes the amendment will speak. Somebody who will support the amendment will speak. So therefore, and there will be hundreds of amendments sometimes. So therefore, so many people will speak. Now therefore, in US, they look not merely at the speech, the recorded speeches that happened at the House when the law was enacted, but they also looked at some of the committee reports. That is, go one step still backward and look at whether the law is propelled by reason of some of the committee reports which said X, Y, Z, and therefore a law is to be required. Therefore a law is required. Therefore there are situations when, so to say for example, the government appoints a committee to look at a particular social scenario. The committee comes up with a report. Based on that report, the government enacts a law, and based on that law there are debates, amendments, etc., and finally law takes a particular shape by the time it is enacted. So you take one step back. First is literal interpretation, you look at the law. Take one step backward, you look at the legislature which read the law. Take one more step backward, you look at the committee which came up with a committee report to understand the intention of the law. So in US, they were inclined to not merely dismiss this as an exclusionary principle, but there were times when they actually looked at the parliamentary material. Sometimes they went by the British principle and said we can't, because of the inarticulate mental process and because of the fact that so many people did not speak who still voted, we will not be able to look at the parliamentary material. But otherwise, in US you will see attempts by some courts to look at it, some courts to not look at it. In India, though in principle we agreed to go by the British model, that is not look at the parliamentary material, till about 1970s. India came independent in 1947, but the Indian judges were not inclined to look at parliamentary material till about 1970s, at which point of time a great judge from this part of the country, from this city, Justice Krishna Iyer, started the process of looking at the parliamentary material. Till then in India, though in the 1950s, I could see one little case law, and this was very interesting. The case law was, there was a company which was into textiles. So, this company was almost taken up by the government. The government came up with a law for this textile, not for the whole textile industry, for this one company, which is a company which employed 1,300 people. For that company, the government came up with a special law and said the shareholders of the company cannot do what they could normally do under the Companies Act in India. All that has to get the government's approval for
for the shareholders to do this or not do that. And they put various restrictions. The government appointed directly some directors on the company's board, etc., and almost took over the entire control of the company. This was challenged in the Supreme Court as being violative of the fundamental principles of law. The shareholders of the company said, how are you distinguishing this one company from all the other companies under the Companies Act? You cannot distinguish and treat us cruelly. Secondly, even if you are distinguishing us from other players in the same industry. So, you are distinguishing us from all other companies functioning under the Companies Act. You are distinguishing us also from the other companies functioning in the area of textile industry, spinning and weaving industry. So how are you doing that? You cannot do that and treat us discriminatively. If you treat us discriminatively, that falls foul of the Indian Constitution. Now at that point in time, I could see the judges of the Supreme Court, without referring to exclusionary rule in Britain, looking at the speech of the Minister for Industries made in the Indian Parliament at the time when the law was enacted, and looking at what exactly was the problem with this particular industry. And at that point in time, the Indian Supreme Court quoted some of the concerned Minister for Industry in the Indian Parliament, and also quoted from the general debates that happened in the Indian Parliament, and said that India was facing acute cloth shortage, and that even if India is facing acute cloth shortage, the government cannot possibly take over all players in the industry. Government will have to look at which industry has a future and not have a future, and government can only take up those industries, those players within the industry which can definitely make a profit at some point in time. And therefore, after looking at all the arithmetics that have gone into the business of it, the government has chosen to take over this particular factory, and looking at the social purpose involved, looking at the interest of the cloth requirement of the country, and looking at the interest of 1,300 laborers who will have to be saved from the company being wound up, the government has taken over the company. And therefore, to understand that social purpose, which alone decoded the question whether there was any discrimination at all that the government came up with, the court indeed looked at the speech of the minister in the parliament. So this was the first instance that I could see where the Indian court actually looked at the parliamentary material to understand at all what was the intention of the legislature. But immediate next year we have a case, and this was a very interesting case, and this would also kind of tickle your interpretative senses. There is a provision of Indian Constitution that says that in the course of export, is that clear? In the course of export, if goods are purchased, then it is not taxable. Sales tax they are dealing with. It's not taxable in the course of export. So the question before the court was, when one particular entity inside India purchased something, inside India purchased a particular good only to export it. So this transaction that the court is bothered about is happening inside India. But why did that transaction happen? Only to get that particular product and export it. Whether that is in the course of export, or only the last transaction is export, or whether the first transaction only for the purpose of last transaction, it can also be called as falling within in the course of export. Is that falling within the course of export and therefore exempt from sales tax? Is that clear? That question came, and this is why I said it could tickle your interpretative senses, because this is a valid debate. I am purchasing it not for using it here or not for selling it within India. I am purchasing it only and only for selling it outside India. So I am purchasing it only for export. So why should I be taxed? So the government took the view no, the sales tax department took the view no, the state took the view no. It said your purchasing is within India and therefore you have to pay sales tax. Once you are exporting it, on that transaction there is no tax, because that alone falls within the phrase in the course of export. This was a typical question that that captured the attention of the judiciary at that point in time. And the High Court, and that case also was from here, the High Court of Travancore, Cochin. The High Court took the view that the High Court actually looked at the parliamentary material. That was not the parliament, that was a constituent assembly which came up with the Indian Constitution.
The High Court looked at the debates in the Constituent Assembly and understood that there was one member of the Constituent Assembly who had suggested an amendment to clarify that provision in the Indian Constitution. And that member had said that you have to, when you say in the course of export, please clarify within the law that you only mean the last transaction. And when you say in the course of import, please clarify that you only mean the first transaction. Understood? Clear? So in the course of export means only the last transaction. For the purpose of last transaction, you might have done series of transactions within the country. That all does not fall within the course of export. In the course of export, will have to be clarified as the last transaction. And that amendment which was suggested in the Constituent Assembly was not allowed by the majority. Therefore, the court says the majority thought that the entire chain could be in the course of export. So look at how you are interpreting the law. You are looking at even an amendment that failed and trying to understand the intention of what the law could be. So they said that an amendment was sought to be brought out clarifying this. That amendment was failed by the majority, and since the majority failed the amendment, the majority's wish is that the entire chain of transaction falls within the course of export, and therefore Sales Tax Department cannot impose the law. The Supreme Court, this was the High Court's view, High Court of Travagapur. The matter went to Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with the final answer that it cannot be only the last transaction, the entire course. But the Supreme Court highly deprecated the High Court's approach of going into the Constituent Assembly debates and said that following the British rule, we cannot look at the intention of the legislature, looking at the material that the legislature itself had before it at the time of passing of the law, because that is an inarticulate mental process. And that inarticulate mental process, since cannot be captured clearly, we are highly deprecating this approach of the High Court in going into a parliamentary debate, the Constituent Assembly debate. So, I have already given you two examples in the 1950s where the confusion existed. In one case, when the industry was taken up, the Supreme Court of India, without referring to exclusionary rule or otherwise, very conveniently took from the Parliament and said the minister said this, the other people said this, so that therefore the law should mean this. In another case, when the High Court took the view based on Constituent Assembly debates and the matter went to the Supreme Court of India, the Supreme Court of India deprecated the High Court for doing that. Now this confusion was cleared in the 1970s by a great jurist by the name Justice Krishna Iyer from this place, who said that this principle has to go. You need to look at what was before the Parliament at the time when the law was enacted. He said we need to look at what the Parliament thought at the time when law was enacted. It was again a very interesting question. So I am giving you some of the snippets from Indian judiciary only because you will understand what are the ambiguities that law can deal with. This is something that will interest you as a public policy researcher. The question was this: Public Service Commission. It is a commission. It is a body state at the state level and at the central level that we have in India. Public Service Commission rules said that a member's tenure will be for 6 years, right? The rules also said that the chairman's tenure will also be for 6 years, right? Clear? So if you are a member of a Public Service Commission, you will serve as a member for 6 years. If you are the chairman of a Public Service Commission, you will serve as a chairman for 6 years. Now one person who was a member who served about 4 or 5 years was promoted as a chair, who was a member was promoted as a chairman. Now he took the view that I have to get the initial 4 years plus 6 years. The government took the view, no, as a member when you are promoted, it all gets covered within your overall tenure, and the intention of law is that member plus chairman you will get only 6 years. So within 2 years you need to go. Another interesting episode that tickles your interpretative exercise. This matter was contested for days and days before the Supreme Court, and finally the Supreme Court said, as a chairman you need to get separate 6 years. So maybe that you will serve 12 years in the Public Service Commission, but it doesn't matter. You need to get 6 years and 6 years, because it is not always the case that a member could be elected as a chairman So as a chairman, when you become, you don't concurrently also function as a member. Only if you concurrently function in two roles can it be said that it comes to an end, it comes to a halt after the 6-year period is over. Moment you become a chairman, you don't simultaneously function as a member, you get into different shoes, and if you get into different shoes, you get 6 years, and therefore this person will eventually serve 10 years, but you can't help it, that's the convention of law. Now, for going into that, Justice Krishna Iyer went into what is actually the parliamentary material that existed when this clause was enacted, and went into elaborate examination. And the challenge before Justice Krishna Iyer was the earlier judgment of the Supreme Court in the 1950s that highly deprecated the High Court's practice in going into Constituent Assembly debate, as I mentioned to you. But Justice Krishna Iyer said that despite a precedent from this very court that said that parliamentary material cannot be gone into, I will have to go into parliamentary material because that practice has to go. We don't need to blindly follow the British. That practice has to go, and we need to look at what our parliamentarians thought and spoke in the parliament at the time when the law was enacted. Now, thereafter you see, even in Britain, they relaxed the rule. Towards in 1990s, in the year 1993, in Britain they came up with a particular case called the Peppers case, when they said that you can look at the concerned minister's speech. You cannot look at anything else. Whatever that concerned minister would have spoken, you take from that and understand the law. So that's the later approach for the dilution of the earlier exclusionary approach that the courts in Britain are now following. They are only looking at the concerned minister's speech and not the broad debate that happened at the time of the enactment of the law. But friends, I must tell you that this is relevant, as I said, only when the law is ambiguous. If the law is clear, you cannot get into the exercise of stepping backward and looking at what is the intention. I'll give you another Indian example. There was a very, very famous political incident that happened in India in the 1993 when the Prime Minister of India, there was a scattered verdict after the general election. The single largest party was the Congress party in India. Our Prime Minister at that point was a person by the name of Narasimha, and there was no confidence because no party could get a clear majority. So the house was scattered. So if you need to be the majority party, you need 50% plus one more person supporting you. Then only can you say 50% of the total seats plus one more seat. Then only can you say that you have a majority and you can rule the country. But here are so many parties and nobody getting that 50% plus one seat. It was a scattered verdict all over the country. In a country like India with such complex population, with so many small tiny parties in various regions, at that point in time the verdict was extremely scattered and no party could get that 50% plus one seat. But the Congress party, amongst all parties, the majority was the Congress party, which still had to get 14 seats for that 50 plus 1. Now, there was a no confidence, so the Congress formed an intermediary government. And there was a no confidence motion to defeat the Congress party that was moved in the Indian legislature. And that no confidence motion was defeated, though Congress party in the election did not have clear majority. That no confidence motion was defeated by people who crossed the floor from one side to the other and gave it exactly the number of votes that it required to have the no confidence motion defeated. And therefore the government continued till the 1996. And this was later, after the government stepped down, later called the infamous Jharkhand Mukti Morcha bribery case in the annals of Indian history, the JMM bribery case, where it was alleged that at that point in time, 3 years back, to defeat the no confidence motion and to herald the government in question, 14 people had taken bribes and had voted against the no confidence motion. This was the allegation. Now, of course, today that case has completely ended and all 14 people stand acquitted because of lack of evidence and all that. There was inconsistency in the statements when the CBI inquiry started, the matter criminal case started. There was inconsistency in the statements of the whistleblower. And finally, for lack of proper evidence, everybody got acquitted. Narasimha Rao, the Prime Minister, also died as a free man, is no more. But the question before the judiciary at that point in time, was this. It's a very interesting question. The question is, can the people who alleged to have taken bribe and therefore crossed swords so as to defeat the no confidence motion against the Narasimha Rao government, can those people be called public servants? That was the question before the Indian Supreme Court. Because Prevention of Corruption Act, under which the Central Bureau of Investigation, the investigating agency, framed charges against these 14 people, said that for invocation of Prevention of Corruption Act, you need to be a public servant. So the question was whether you are a public servant when you become a member of the Indian Parliament. This was a question before the Indian judiciary. In a landmark case, the Supreme Court held yes, by virtue of being a member of the Indian Parliament, you are a public servant. Now the arguments that was devised on behalf of the then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and those accused was that at the time when this is where the interpretation comes. At the time when the Prevention of Corruption Act was enacted, the question was, the Prevention of Corruption Act, says that you can move against a public servant. So you have the Prevention of Corruption Act and it used the word public servant. So the question was, by being a member of the Indian Parliament, are you a public servant? So that you can be booked under the Prevention of Corruption Act. The two arguments were raised by the accused by saying that the members of Parliament were not public servants. The primary argument was, public servant is defined to be a person who by virtue of his office, that's the word that the statute uses, by virtue of his office, he does a public duty. Now look at how lawyers are engineering. The lawyer said public servant is defined in the Prevention of Corruption Act to be a person who holds an office doing a public duty. Then he said, you look at the Indian Constitution, a Supreme Court judge's office is called an office, a president's office is called an office, a vice president's office is called an office, several people's office is called an office, but you look at a member of Indian Parliament, his office is not called office, it is called a seat, and therefore it is not an office. If it's not an office, it is not a public servant, and therefore Prevention of Corruption Act does not apply. Look at the ingenuity. He said, in the Indian Constitution, you scan through the Indian Constitution. There is not a single provision in the Indian Constitution where qua a member of an Indian Parliament, the word office is used. Throughout, the word used is seat. If you are using the word seat, then it is not an office. If it's not an office, he is not a public servant, and therefore no Prevention of Corruption Act, and therefore no conviction under the under the terms of the Prevention of Corruption Act. Second argument that they raised, and this is what is relevant to us, is that they quoted the minister who moved the Prevention of Corruption Act when the law was enacted. Therefore, this question was there. When the Prevention of Corruption Act was enacted, as to whether a member of the Parliament would get covered under the Prevention of Corruption Act under the definition of public servant. There they quoted a minister, the then concerned minister who moved the legislation. The concerned minister happens to be the present Home Minister of India, a very articulate person, a very well-educated person, a lawyer, a distinguished lawyer by himself. He had taken a view in the Indian Parliament that no, the members of Indian Parliament do not automatically become public servant. But if you get into a secondary role along with your primary role, for example, a member of Indian Parliament can be appointed as member of a delegation to look at something, or he can be appointed as a member of the Public Service Commission, or he can be appointed as XYZ, he can be appointed as a relief committee chairman. So as a member of the Indian Parliament, you can be taken and you can be appointed as somebody else. In respect of that particular action alone, you are a public servant. Merely because you are elected to the Indian Parliament, you are not a public servant. This is what the concerned minister, highly educated, a very well-respected person, Home Minister of India, had spoken at the time of moving this Prevention of Corruption Bill, which became the Prevention of Corruption Act. So, in this particular case, in the JMM corruption bribery case, the accused lawyer referred to that parliamentary material, that is the speech of the minister, and said, no, therefore, merely by becoming a member of the Indian Parliament, you are not a public servant. This is what the legislature had intended. Look at the minister's speech. This is what the minister himself said when the law was moved. And the Supreme Court said no. And this is why I am saying, if the law is clear, you are not required to look at or permitted to look at as a court. You are not required to take a step back and look at what the minister spoke. He said no. The law, minister might have meant it. Minister might have meant anything. Doesn't matter. But look at the written law. The law uses the word office by virtue of which you do public duty. Now office in the Indian Constitution, the word seat may be used. But there is another legislation which looks at salary and allowances of public called the Representation of People's Act, by which you look at the salary and allowances of the members of Indian Parliament, and that uses the word office. Plus, you look at the oath that the members take, and that oath uses the word the duty upon which I am entering. So therefore there is no doubt that office is satisfied, duty is satisfied, and therefore he is a public servant, and therefore Prevention of Corruption Act. And therefore the Indian Supreme Court said that there is no ambiguity in this phrase, and therefore I am not supposed to look at what the minister would have thought. Now today I am speaking about a minister who knows his law and who is a very articulate person. We might not always end up with ministers or members of parliament who are so articulate. So therefore, when you say look at the intention of the legislature, you are always taking a risk looking at the speeches of those ministers who may not even know what they are speaking. Therefore, you cannot attribute perfection to a speech made in the house of the legislature at the time of the enactment of the law, as said by the great old English principle that said exclude the exclusionary rule. So it's an inarticulate mental process that results in the law. That law is still valid in as much as the enacted piece of the legislation is clear, and therefore you are not required to step back and look at what the legislature would have thought about. Therefore, it's always a balance that the judiciary has to keep. The law is clear, look at it grammatically, look at it literally. If the law is unclear, try and go back and look at what the legislature would have thought, and still you may come up with absurdities. You might have had ministers who might have made absurd speeches. Certain people, for various reasons, language may fail them. For various reasons, you might not be able to decipher if you look at the parliamentary material. And therefore, it's always a fair and vigilant balance that the judiciary is supposed to keep when it looks at. I'm coming back to my original approach now. When it looks at how to look at the society through the eyes of the law. So all this I'm linking up with my initial plank, that is, when you look at the society as a court of law, you can look at it through the eyes of law. And the alternative approach is what I'm just now coming to concluding my speech, that is, you look at the law through the eyes of the society. That is something that you regularly see in the court of law. Any legislation, when it comes, the people can take it to the court of law and say, I do not agree with this legislation. Because from my perspective, from the society's perspective, the legislation is bad. And that is a typical example when the court gets into what happens when a new law comes. The court will be called upon to answer this question as to what the society thinks about it. And the society can take that legislation to the court and challenge what is called the virus of that legislation. And the court can look at it from a society's perspective to challenge that legislation and approve the challenge to the legislation. But there are instances, the other instances. So one is, when you look at it, the law, he looks at him through him. So when the court looks at the law from the eyes of the society, Point number one is, if the new law is bad, you can strike it down. That is, the court can strike it down. Because that law is not what is required by the society. Two is, if it is an existing law, I am not talking about the new law now. So this is a new law. If it is an existing law, but the restricted approach at that point in time when the law was enacted is not presently enough to understand that law, then you widen the scope of that law. So you allow the law to stand. So you don't strike down, but using your own, that's the court's own powers, it widens the law through an interpretative exercise. I'll give you one typical example. There is a provision of law, again I am taking a recourse to Indian example, but it is acceptable everywhere. There is a provision in the Indian Evidence Act that says that if a person is examined in a court of law, he has to be examined in the presence of the accused or his lawyer. Right? Now there was one medical negligence case where the concerned doctor was sitting in the United States, and by then the video conferencing facility had come. So the question before the Indian Supreme Court was, using video conferencing, can it be called in the presence of the accused or his lawyer? So the lawyer and his accused, the accused and his lawyer are present in the court, judge is present in the court. The one to be examined is sitting in United States, and in the court there is a video conferencing facility. Can it be said that video conferencing examination satisfies the Indian law that says he has to be necessarily examined in the presence of the witness? There the court said that at the point in time, and this is very important, you don't sometimes, as a court of law, you are not supposed to exceed your brief. You are not supposed to think more than what the law would have thought. The law enacting entity would have thought at that point. But the Supreme Court said no. Law enacting entity at that point in time in the 19th century when the Indian Evidence Act was enacted could not have thought of video conferencing. Right? And still the Supreme Court said, but the written law permits that in the presence of the accused, using any mode, in the presence of the accused or his pleader, the party can be examined, and therefore you don't look at what the creator would have thought about it. But the creature, that is the law itself, permits it. And this presence through the video conferencing is a good enough presence to satisfy that. So here is an example when you don't strike down the law, but you widen the law through your own interpretative exercise and take it much beyond even what the person who would have enacted the law would have thought about or could have even imagined about. Video conferencing was never a facility that could have been imagined at the time when the Indian Evidence Act was enacted. So you take it even much beyond, you think ahead of times, and you allow the law to stand but increase its amplitude. That's another approach that you do when you look at the law through the eyes of the society. The third that you do is, now I'll deal with a new law or I'll deal with an existing law. The third that you do is an existing law which had definitely had an approved earlier, is now struck down. So this is also possible. Now you don't need to challenge only the new legislations. You can go and challenge a legislation which is age old and say in the new changed social circumstances that legislation is not relevant and therefore it has to be struck down. A typical example is what the Delhi High Court in the year 2009 did with a provision of the Indian Penal Code dealing with homosexuality. Now, homosexuality in the annals of history was considered to be a sin as per the orthodox Christian principles. Now, in Britain, it was penalized in the 16th century. One penal provision was enacted, and throughout the history, the British followed it till recently. homosexuality was considered to be not merely a religious sin, but also illegal. Now the Delhi High Court, now that was captured in the Indian Penal Code 1860. So 1860 is when the Indian Penal Code was affected and was enacted, and homosexuality was captured to be a legal offence. In the year 2009, that is, I am speaking about 150 years later after the Indian Penal Code was enacted, 150 years, a century and a half later, the Delhi High Court said that provision is invalid. That homosexuality is just another matter of sexual expression of a human being, and therefore the law at that point might have been valid. All through the annals of history, so many cases decided under that law for that particular period in time when the case would have been enacted, when the case came up before the judiciary, was valid. But in today's scenario, I see homosexuality as just an alternative expression of human sexuality, and it is not an aberration. And for that, they quoted the American psychiatrist literature. They quoted the World Health Organization's action of deleting homosexuality from being a mental aberration, and they also quoted the recent British example of taking away homosexuality from the law book and decriminalizing it. So they used all these world approaches and said in India also we think that homosexuality is no more something to be considered as a penal offence, and therefore it should have no place whatsoever in the penal book of India. The matter is today before the Supreme Court, and very interestingly, two ministries within the government have taken two different stands. The Home Ministry has taken one stand, the Ministry of Family Welfare has taken another stand. So look at how the society influences the law. The government itself has a split within it as to how to look at a problem like or a problem or a feature phenomenon like homosexuality. And the court said, the High Court said, homosexuality is just an alternative expression of sexuality, and there is no, at least there is no penal provision, penal consequence involved in it. But the matter is before the Supreme Court can say otherwise. So this is another method by which the the court looks at the law through the eyes of the society, and when the society itself changes, what was very much valid earlier and has been valid through the annals of history is today considered to be bad and struck down. This is the third. And the fourth and the last is when a new law which may at an earlier instance a similar law may have been approved, but in today's instance the new law is struck down. I'll give another Indian example, that is in the state of, there is one state in India called Gujarat. In the state of Gujarat, when slaughtering of cow, calf, buffalo, etc. was banned, basically beef as a meat to consume was banned within the state of Gujarat. The matter went to the Supreme Court. A similar matter had gone earlier to the Supreme Court, much earlier, in the year 1951, when some other states tried doing the same. At that point of time, Supreme Court had said, no, you cannot completely ban it. You can ban certain categories. You can ban, say, a cattle that has gone past a particular age and therefore of no use to the society, just no, cannot be used for milk, it cannot be used for agricultural purpose, or as a labor it cannot be used. And such category, you may say that those category of cattle which have some use can be banned from being slaughtered, but complete ban is disapproved, was the approach that the Supreme Court had taken earlier in the year 1951. In 2006, the Supreme Court approved a complete ban on cow slaughter in the state of Gujarat. And the reason given was, and this is interesting, this is why I say look at the law through the eyes of the society. Supreme Court looked at what happened since 1951 till 2006 in the Indian economics, in the Indian society. And the Supreme Court said that in 1951, when they said complete ban of cow slaughter was not permitted, there was an acute fodder shortage, which is not the case today. So because of acute fodder shortage, at that point in time, you might have banned complete, but today that's not the case. Instead, staple diet. It said that it was a time when beef had to be considered as a protein staple diet for the Indian population for the simple reason that India was going through food shortage. Now today there is surplus food. It's only a problem of distribution. You just go down the road, you will see all kinds of food stores available. You see all kinds of multinational companies having come into the food industry. There's enough of food. It's only a question of inequity in the distribution of the food. The question is whether you need to you need to knock the door of a Kentucky chicken, or you need to have bigger or simple food. That's the only question. But food is available. So therefore, a point in time when food shortage was acute in India, and the judgment passed at that point in time cannot be the same which can be looked at this point in time. So the Supreme Court said what was valid earlier needn't be valid today. And this is another approach that I want to bring before you, where a law which would have been approved earlier needn't stand even now, it can be struck down. So we have four situations. A new law can be struck down. Say for example, the government today comes up with an anti-terrorist law, and it can be said that excessive powers are given to the police, this law has to go and it can be struck down. Two is a new law which might have been approved earlier can still be struck down. Three is an existing law which needn't be struck down but can be widened. And four is an existing law which was approved earlier can still be struck down. So you have all kinds of permutation combinations there. An existing law can stand, but its meaning can be taken to much higher level than what the legislature could have thought at that point. An example is video conferencing. An existing law which was approved earlier might not be approved today. Example is homosexuality. A new law which was never earlier and therefore there was no question of looking at it and comes today can be struck down. Say an anti-terrorist law. A new law, a semblance of which was there earlier and approved, but can be struck down even now. An example is this house property. So therefore the question becomes extremely complex. The question, when you look at as a public policy researcher at legal system, becomes extremely complex because you need to constantly think about the economics, you need to think about the intention of the legislature, you need to look at what the law itself says, whether that is in conflict with the so-called interest, the intention. You need to look at the social setup, you need to look at the change in the social setup, you need to look at what can come in future when you say a particular interpretation fits the bill. All this becomes extremely important, and therefore the courts world over have always respected the perspective of public policy researchers. This is where the interrelationship. The interrelationship is something that I wanted to highlight in today's talk. A public policy research perspective is extremely important even from a judge's perspective. Likewise, when you look at a judgment as a non-lawyerly person, you need to question it from the society's perspective. You need to look at what the law says, you need to look at what the intention of the law would have been, you need to look at what was the social setup at the time of the law, you need to look at what is the social situation today, you need to look at what could be the social situation tomorrow. All this will have to be looked at from a public policy perspective when you try and appreciate even a single piece of legislation. It is to enumerate this that I make this effort to speak to you about various concerns that at various points of time arose before the Indian judiciary. I stop here and I say once again that as a court of law, we look at both law through the eyes of society and society through the eyes of law. I would only quote one paragraph from Indian Supreme Court's one of the judgments to exemplify this. I quote it very slowly so that you can possibly try and capture the jurisprudential language used here. It says like this. According to, this is from a judgment of the Indian Supreme Court made in the year 2005. The Supreme Court says, according to Professor Lloyd, concepts are good servants but bad masters. Rules which are originally designed to fit the social needs develop into concepts which then proceed to take on a life of their own to the detriment of legal development. Understood? I will repeat it. Rules which are originally designed to fit social needs develop into a concept which then proceed to take on a life of their own to detriment of legal development. So, here is a social need based on which a concept has evolved. That concept matures into a law, but the moment it matures into law, it hits the social need. And therefore the law continues to govern the social need despite the fact that social need would have proceeded much further. Therefore it impedes the law. It's a challenge to itself if the law doesn't change. I'll read it again. Rules which are originally designed to fit social needs develop into concepts which then proceed to take on a life of their own to the detriment of legal development. The resulting jurisprudence of concepts produces a slot machine approach to the law whereby new points posing questions of social policy are decided not by reference to the underlying social situation but by reference to the meaning and definition of the legal policies concepts involved. Therefore what it says is, if you don't appreciate as a court of law to the underlying social principle at the time when the law was enacted, then you will continue to look at law only from the law's perspective. You will not look at the society. And you will do injustice to the society because the law would have by then attained the growth of itself. You are creating something and that creature grows on itself. Several cases would have been decided under that law. So it has an organic growth. Because of a social need, you unleash a law. And then the law gets into a life of its own. And it becomes so formidable that you look at it from its own perspective, it will defeat the changing social needs. And Supreme Court says, this formalistic a priori approach confines the law in a straitjacket instead of permitting it to expand to meet the new needs and requirements of the society. Such an approach is to be welcomed but is also warranted by comment. Now the reverse it is giving. That is, if you don't look at law as a stable, clear, cogent facet of rules, then what happens? Then says, such an approach is to be welcome, but it also warrants two comments. First, judicial inquiry into the general effects of a proposed decision tends to itself be fairly speculative in nature. Now first point is, if you don't allow the law to be looked at from the society's perspective, then you are doing injustice to the society. But if you always keep the law as fluid, if you don't introduce definiteness in law, if you don't introduce concreteness in law, if you don't introduce conclusiveness in law, then what I am giving you the example of the sales tax, service tax issue that I told you right at the beginning. Landlord says something, tenant says something, I as a landlord for the tenant says something, judge will say something, finally. So there is no concreteness in law. But this was not thought of when the law was enacted. Nobody thought of this situation. It's a peculiar situation arising out of a peculiar contract between parties. Now the law cannot think of 1,000 variants of contracts and then enact itself. Now what happens if you keep the law fluid, if you keep the law flexible, if you keep the law always emerging and without any conclusion? It says, the judicial inquiry into the general effects of a proposed decision tends itself to be fairly speculative in nature. So if the courts always get into the speculative exercise, what will be the effect? Then it becomes extremely subjective. Then nobody will be able to predict a pattern for the law. That is also dangerous, equally dangerous. And it says, secondly, too much regard for policy and too little for legal consistency may result in a confusing and illogical complex of contrary decisions. Therefore, if each court gets into different interpretation based on different societal needs as they conceive, as judges they conceive, then law will be left to anybody's imagination. There will be no conclusiveness in law. Now what do you do? This is a challenge that Friends, as public policy researchers, you have to bear in mind when you take up any judicial decision. And this today is the sense that I wanted to instill in you. Therefore, the Supreme Court says, while it is true that the life of law has not been logic, it has been experience, that the life of law is not merely logic, it is experience. And that we should not wish otherwise. Nevertheless, we should remember that no system of law can be workable if it has got no logic at the root of it. So, it is not merely logic, it is also experience. It is not merely experience, it is also logic. Without logic, it becomes subjective. Without experience being factored in, it becomes insensitive. So this, friends, as public policy researchers, I will conclude, is where you would need to step in. And this is, I have tried to bring it down to examples, and I have tried in my speech to explain the genuine concerns which have arisen before our courts in India, and try to explain and try to give a sense of what could happen around the globe and what happens around the globe every day. But at any point of time, if I have got amorphous, if I have got a little unclear, or if I have got too conceptual, that's only because this is the subject that I wanted to introduce you. And the subject takes within it the challenge of being a little conceptual. The subject takes within itself the predicament that all of us every day as lawyers undergo, and when you as public policy researchers look at the subject, would naturally have to undergo till the cows come home. Thank you so much.